Всем привет, дорогие друзья! Приветствует вас Юра и...
Cato from St. Petersburg, Florida.
Yes, and I'm all the way here in New York. And today we're gonna talk. We're gonna do our. This is our third podcast, and we're gonna focus on a subject that actually connects us both. It's the Russians that lived in Uptown Manhattan in an area known as Hamilton Heights. And this is all about our Zarubezhye specifically, right, Kato?
Yeah, we're focusing as again we are the Rush Tsar, and we're focusing on Russkiy Zarubezhye, the old Russkiy Zarubezhye, or the so-called first and second waves.
Right. So let's start right away with that. Let's talk about the fact that our ancestors left Russia in two distinct time periods, in the period during the Russian Civil War and right after, and then post World War II, where there was a major movement of people. Some people were brought to Germany forcefully, some people were prisoners of war. And there was a whole redrawing of the map in Europe at that time, which created a lot of complications. So that's what I'm just referred to as the second wave of emigres. The first wave of emigres were those that left as a result of the revolution and the Civil War. Of course, these people were primarily anti-communist, and they came, to other countries because they had no choice, right?
Right. Again, those what years are we talking about? We're talking about Civil War, 1918, 1920, once people start moving around already, right? Escaping or saving their lives is another way of putting it, right?
Retreating is a better way of putting it in
Probably
many ways, because a
retreating.
lot of these people felt an active role in combating the Bolshevik Revolution,
Ah,
and
that's
they,
another
they
that's another topic to discuss about, right?
that's an entire podcast at the least, if not several.
Yeah.
But either way, these people found themselves for the most part in Europe after World War II. We're not talking about the people that were in the Дальневосточная emigre, those people that were
Sure.
that left originally from Siberia,
To China,
Urals, Siberia.
China to Australia and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a separate route. We're talking about the people that came from countries like Yugoslavia, Germany, the Balkans, Czechoslovakia,
Sure. Sure.
and a lot of these people ended up in the United States. Either they made it, in the 40 after World War II directly to New York, like in my case, or like in the case of Kato's parents, actually originally went from there to South America and then
Right.
made it
They're
to New
from
York.
route. Exactly. They made it down to South America. That is Venezuela, to be exact. More exact is Caracas, Venezuela. And from there, they made it to New York through Tosovsky Fond or uh, through relatives. Right. So I've got both sides.
Right. That's a very interesting point, because after World War II, there was, of course, a very big danger for some Russians that were going to be forcibly repatriated to the Soviet government, which could have meant either their death or their incarceration.
Sure.
Regardless of their political opinions or whatever, that
Yeah.
wasn't even the issue at stake a lot of
Yeah.
times.
Right after,
Stalin,
well, we all know that Kazaki, right? What happened in the 40s, right after the war? Stalin, right?
right, he was paranoid about anybody who was from that part of the world, because they figured they saw a different life, and he didn't want that. He was afraid of their influence in Europe, and so he sought to basically, capture and destroy what he could.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that didn't work out for a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people were saved from that. A lot of people also did perish. It was a very difficult time after World War II. So essentially, Europe was a mess, and people had to, it was just after the war. You had communist influence showing up in certain Eastern European countries where also in Yugoslavia. So it was a difficult time period, and people had to move on if they wanted to survive. And that's what led people ultimately to come to the United
Yeah.
States. And it was an interesting path. So you mentioned the Tolstoy Foundation.
Right.
Maybe you want to just go into a little bit
Let
what
me
it is the
let me
Tolstoy
just
Foundation.
add to this a little bit, right? That we have to understand we're talking about 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right? And the main way to travel back then was still through the ships. right? It was not flying. It's not pack up your bags and go on a flight,
Yeah, Delta Airlines.
right? It's that. I don't know how many people did from those years, but it was still all pretty much through by ship. So,
Ellis Island. Those who came, when they came to the States, it was Ellis Island. And yeah, these were journeys that were not easy. They still cost a lot of money, and it was a difficult path for people. And my mother's family, for example, had a very unsympathetic captain of the ship who was very pro-Soviet, and he wasn't exactly happy that there were anti-communist Russians on his ship.
do you
So it was a
remember? Do you, by any chance, do you remember the name of the ship that your grandparents and so on came on? Do you know what ship?
my father's side of the family came on the USS Liberty.
Okay, so Liberty. Okay, my
Don't know, not sure about my mom's side, but
my father came on Abraham Lincoln.
wow, interesting names on all these ships, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Very historically related.
Also an interesting topic.
Yeah, another interesting topic. But yeah, they have these manifests, and as we were discussing earlier, there would be a print in the Novoe Russkoe Slovo, which, just to give some background, this is a Russian language newspaper that was originated in 1911. It was actually founded by Russian Jews. But then when Russian Slavs started coming to the United States, that also became like their main newspaper. And they
Well,
would
it was a
print manifests.
Russian language newspaper, and it really, in the beginning, it was like you said, it was Russian Jewish, and it was always Russian Jewish owned, always,
Right.
right? But it was, but there's a story behind that as well because initially it was more of a leftist newspaper. And then when Andrei Sudovoy, what was his name?
Sidich.
Sidich, right? Came into, he opened it up for both sides, all sides. So you had a lot of pravoslavne as well as Jewish sharing, holidays, and it was just a very interesting concoction. And it was a main internet per se. It was a main communication. So if anyone came into the country, it would be the first newspaper to grab, get a hold of, and to find that room or find that job and so on. Another interesting topic.
Yeah, well, luckily, you've spent a lot of time analyzing clippings and saving clippings
Oh
from
yeah,
Novoe
oh
Russkoe
yeah,
Slovo.
oh yeah.
By the way, my grandfather also wrote for them at one point, and it's a very interesting chronicle of emigre life when you take a look at it, right?
Absolutely. There's a lot to be. They're still adding additions that they haven't found because all these newspapers, how do you archive it all? So they had a humongous task of finding, locating all these archives and putting it together. I still believe they don't have it in full.
Right. No, it's very interesting. Yeah, so that's kind of a very good blueprint for a lot of the research that you've done in the past on the subject of Russians coming to the United States, and helps figure out what like major news events, what stores existed,
Well, exactly what we're
who
heading to. Right, exactly. That's why we're
right,
heading
who
in.
who was born, who passed away, et cetera, et cetera. It was an amazing, it's an amazing time capsule essentially of information.
A simple thing as a person dying, right? It will always be on the front page. It wouldn't be in the second or third page. It was on the front page because it was news. Because that's how spread out that people knew somebody who knew someone, right? So it would be on the first page that this person died. Very interesting. Again, think about it. Obituaries on the first page.
Absolutely. So anyway, thanks to the research that you've done, we can start piecing together, and of course, family memories. What we have, right? Because both of our families ended up living in Uptown Manhattan, where there was basically a basic Russian white/second wave immigration enclave of sorts. It wasn't as much as I would say the Greeks of Astoria, maybe,
Right.
but
It wasn't, right. But nevertheless, it was an area, a community, right.
yeah, it was a community that was centered heavily around several buildings where there were a lot of newly arrived Russians, and also there was even some stores, and of course an Orthodox church. And we're gonna, throughout this podcast and our sequels, we're going to be discussing these in some detail. We're going to take a visit to these places and see what's left and try to piece together the whole story. And in that sense, we're also inviting all of you who are listening to participate in this podcast because we
Absolutely.
need your feedback.
And not just us. We're trying to save all this information because everyone's input is just as important. Everyone. So any comment written down or shared with us, please do. The more names, the more information we could get. We're preserving history.
Absolutely. So let's start with just a very brief discussion of why people ended up in this part of Manhattan. So, for starters, this area is known today as Hamilton Heights. And as we previously discussed, this is I wouldn't say it's an arbitrary name because it does have a Wikipedia page attached to it, but Manhattan tends to be known for regions that are not tied to a specific postal code. You don't write down Hamilton Heights when you're sending a letter
Right.
to Hamilton Heights. You just write New York, New York, unlike Queens, which is a little bit more territorial that way. So what's interesting is that these definitions sort of come and go with time, and the general area is known as Western Harlem, right? But it's not the kind of Harlem that you imagine, like the Harlem Renaissance Harlem. That's already different. That was a primarily black area. This area was much more mixed, and by the time that a lot of Russian Americans arrived there, it coincided with one of the Great Migration from Puerto Rico, which happened right after World War II, right?
Right.
Because Puerto Rico at that time was trying to establish its place in the American, citizenry and all that, and you had a lot of Puerto Ricans coming in there as well. The area was certainly less expensive than a lot of other parts of Manhattan, which made it definitely affordable. And just to give you a little context, to those of you who know West Side Story, well, this is roughly the same. This is
Oh,
exactly the
hey,
same time period that this
everyone,
has happened.
everyone who they never would say Hamilton Heights or Washington Heights. Very extremely rare. But if it was a reference to, they would say, "Hey, that's where I grew up and where West Side Story is." I mean, you would hear that numerous of times, right? Oh, you're from the West Side Story area, right? So that was a reference, and sure, that's why I would say myself. I'm from the West Side Story area.
There you go. So, interesting times. I mean, it was also not an easy time because all of these people had just come off the boat. They had to have jobs. They had to have a place to live. And like my grandfather, for example, went to work for the Lions Match Factory, which was in Long Island City. He was already in his 50s at that time.
It
And
was the go-to
Lions
place.
Match
It was the
Lions
go.
Match Company was founded. I have a difficult time getting the exact history of it. Apparently, it was founded by a Russian Jew, but there were also Russian white emigres who were either involved in management or somewhere in there, or maybe even acquired it. I still want to figure that out. And my grandfather would commute from Upper Manhattan to Long Island City and work there, where he had many of his previous White Army veteran buddies that would be working
It
there
was
as
the
well.
go-to place of just practically if Russians arrived, and not just Russians, but mostly with Russians. They ended up working at the line match factory. Exactly. I mean, they would get off the boat. Where could I find a job? Boom. There's a line match company, and a lot of well-known people actually. That's where they started.
Absolutely. So this is basically, how you started out. And people would initially start by renting rooms. They wouldn't rent the whole apartment. You didn't have the income or whatever you needed to do that. So, from what I heard from a family friend of mine, a good childhood friend of my father's who grew up in that area, a lot of Russians initially lived on 139th Street and they rented rooms there
Yep.
in those buildings. And then, as people were able to, and there was the one place that ended up really the one building that ended up attracting the most Russian emigres was 3456 Broadway off of 141st Street. That was nicknamed Russkiy Dom specifically, not to be confused with Dom Svobodной России, which was on the west side on 86th Street.
Exactly. You got 141st Street and Broad West 141st Street and Broadway. That area was the Russian community. It's not the Bryant Beach area that came in the 70s, right? So a lot of people don't know this, and that's why we're making this point here, is that this community developed the first real Russian community, as we understand. This is where it developed this entire area.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think one thing that we're trying to get our minds around here is who was, as we call it jokingly, Russian Zero, the first
Yeah.
Russian that moved into that area that obviously started drawing other Russians to come there. And one thing we sort of focused our attention on is the Orthodox
Lord
Church
Church.
that is still there to this day on
Yeah.
153rd Street between Broadway and Amsterdam, the Holy Fathers Russian Orthodox Church, originally founded in the more traditional part of Harlem on 128th and 29th Street off Fifth Avenue, and then it moved in the late 1930s. It ended up moving all the way to 153rd Street, originally in a cellar, and then in 1962 it ended up, acquiring its own a proper building and a neighboring building, and where it continues to exist. So if there was a church that moved there in the late 30s, that means there must have been some Russians
Something
already,
there,
right?
exactly, that drew it there. Exactly, there must have been a large community,
Right. So very
and
interesting.
that would be really in the late 50s, well, 50s. Let's just keep it there at 50s and early 60s. Why would it be there later? Would it make sense, right? Because time,
Absolutely.
demographically, everything changed.
So I'm going to now cite a piece of research that another interesting piece of research that you did. I believe I forgot which paper this was you found it in, but you found an article that was written in 1940, before World War II. Well, as World War II
What
was
what
going
was
on, but
happening?
before the U.S. involvement, where a certain Zhana Perlova, who was 19 years old, was some kind of a circus performer, and they cite her address as being 3456 Broadway, the so-called Russkiy Dom.
Sure.
So,
And 19 years old, so puts her in born in 1920, right? Roughly, right? So it's that generation that was there. Where was she originally from? I don't know. We don't know. But nevertheless, she lived at that house, and that's in 1940.
it's very interesting because prior to World War II, especially like between the period of the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and World War II, there were not many Russians that were from the white emigre world that were coming to the United States. There was a strict quota system, and a lot of them preferred to stay closer to Russia. They thought that the
Eventually,
situation
right,
with the
change.
Soviets would ultimately resolve somehow, and they'd be able to return to their homes. They didn't want to go too far. But after World War II, when the Eastern Bloc became very big and the Soviet influence was expanding, they did not, they felt unsafe
Yep.
essentially, and they had to, there were also threats of revolution happening in Western European countries at the time too, in Italy, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So it was not a very stable situation, and they
Well,
decided to find safe harbor.
that's again another discussion, right? But nevertheless, the Russians did end up staying in Germany, right? What's close by, France, England, right? Though not too many ended up going to Ireland or to Scotland. They were Cyprus, which I was amazed that there was actually a colony there. But yeah, those that heard that America is a place to go to, land of opportunity and dreams, and those that came here through New York, right? This was their starting point, and that's exactly what we're focusing on because this was theirs. The Ukrainians had their section, right, down eastward, right in New York City, but
And pardon me, we're talking about specifically people from Western Ukraine who would,
yeah,
at
yeah,
that time, that's the
exactly.
association people had. People from what is today Eastern Ukraine did not feel themselves that way. So it was kind of you saw people from there or from the
Galicia,
Carpathian
right?
area.
Galicia, whatever, right?
Right, Galice, right, like where Lwów and so on are located. Right, that's what we're referring to. People who are Catholic, or whatever they tend to associate there. So that's
Right.
yeah. If we're talking about Second Avenue on the Lower East Side,
Though saying that, still there were those Russians that still wanted to deal with them or lived within those areas, and vice versa. It's very complex, that history.
sure, absolutely. So, so essentially, it's still a very big mystery how we ended up having Russians specifically in Hamilton Heights. Why was that a popular area? Because if we take a look at the city in general, if you're an immigrant and you're coming in here, right, what do you need? You need affordable housing. You need to be able to work. You need to be able to have access to public transportation. No one's gonna, you're not gonna buy a car, coming off the boat.
Yeah.
And it's also nice that your children are going to be able to get free public education, right? So when you combine all of these things, the city is a very attractive place to start your life. And that continues to this very day, by the way. And most importantly for these people was the opportunity to live close to each other, right? And this Russkiy Dom essentially made that possible because your parents and you even lived there. My grandparents and my father lived there, and it was a very it was a pretty tight knit community.
Yeah. My grandmother was set there. I can't say right now, of course, that when she moved into that building, but she did. She was already living in the 50s, early 50s, and yeah, my parents, packed up their bags in Caracas, Venezuela, and moved there. And next thing you know, they're getting married in New York City at the Synodalne Cerkev, and not at 153rd. I don't know the reason. I wouldn't know, probably because it was a basement church per se. Maybe it wasn't as interesting. I don't know those reasons. But the photos exist, and that's what I shared with you. You could actually see the photos of them spending their time.
Yeah, no, it's. I also have pictures of family, get-togethers, and it's interesting. You were in a whole building where you knew everybody or most of the
There,
people there pretty well.
everybody, yeah, it seems like everybody knew each other. Really
Yeah.
did. Absolutely.
So we have a lot of other things that we're also going to discuss. I mean, like some of the interesting people that lived in that area, the stores that existed there, and again, we're going to have live footage from those areas, which we're going to share with you. And as we're discussing all of this, one of the key reasons why people would live in a specific area is of sponsorship. And when the Tolstoy Foundation would, have arranged for people to emigrate from Europe or whatever South America, you would have to have a sponsor. So it wouldn't just be the Tolstoy Foundation, sponsoring you. You would have an individual family that would sponsor you. And, I think we can agree that the likeliest scenario, because, for example, my mom, she lived in the exact area where their sponsors lived in Brooklyn. And I think it was the same with the Russkiy Dom on 3456 Broadway. You had people that probably were sponsoring each other that would come there and would move in, basically.
Sure. Family, relatives, right.
Right. Another interesting draw for that area, like again, I mentioned education. My father, for example, he studied in a Catholic school, is considered a more traditional and probably even a safer alternative than the public school system. And what happened essentially was that, if you were a good student, and it was hard to get in at that time, hard to imagine now, because it's a very different school, but there was the City College, which still exists there, City College of New York. And what's interesting about it is that it was the first public university free of charge in the United States. And it was founded in 1846, I believe. Beautiful architecture. And it was a very difficult school to get into. It was like, we're talking like, Ivy League level practically, because you got a free ride when you got in there.
Yeah.
And, many Russians aspired to have their kids go there. And in the case of my father, he got in, but it even took him a little bit. He had to come in as a non-matriculant at first, in order to get in. And then, all of a sudden you had all of these radical social movements happen in the late 60s. And then they made it open admissions in 1970, and the whole thing just, the academic standards plummeted.
Yeah.
Luckily, my dad graduated before that happened, but that's kind of emblematic of what happened generally with the whole neighborhood.
Well, my father graduated and got his diploma in Venezuela, right, in Caracas. And when he finished up medical school, dentistry, and when he came in 1956 to New York and found out that he won't be able to use his degree at all. He's going to have to go again. He chose NYU, New York University, the dental school there.
My alma mater.
So it was still prestigious to go there. And my father graduated top of the line because he already knew everything. He had everything. And though here's an interesting point, somewhat not related. How did my father start learning English? He already knew English, Russian, and Spanish by living in Caracas, Venezuela. He also knew, of course, French and German. But how did he pick up English? This is just, again, out of the blue remembering this. My father started picking it up from during World War II, when he was in Germany, surviving in Germany in the basements of Germany during the bombardments and so on, American bombs. All the American personnel were leaving, the GI Joes leaving their comic strip books. So the Spider-Mans and so whatever they were, my father would read those and start piecing the language together. You know, the boom, the whatever, all those words written in there, he started learning from that. That's how he picked up his
Impressive.
English.
Well, also, I guess if you study medicine, you know some Latin, so that
Latin words, of course, all connected.
that helps.
Absolutely.
Impressive, yeah. I mean, you definitely got to be good at studying when you're a doctor, right? It's
Exactly.
you can't be a bad student.
He had to know English, and he did actually quite well. He actually graduated top of the line, and it went.
Well, this is actually a very important point because if we're going to talk about the Russian, first and second wave emigres that came to the United States, first of all, they were not really. I mean, in some ways, you could say there was an economic motive to come to the United States, perhaps, but they started their lives as political refugees. They were not. These people, had no choice to leave Russia. They didn't want to leave Russia. It was something they had to do, essentially. And what's amazing about it is that they really, they were hardworking people. They came here, they honestly came here legally, and they worked hard for their, diplomas, and then they were able to create a life for themselves here. And this is what's interesting about, that Hamilton Heights region is that these people came there. They had, maybe for if we're going to roughly say how long Russians were living there in a significant enough quantity, we'd probably say it was less than 20 years, pretty much from
Sure.
1950 something, right?
Sure.
1951, 1950 maybe, through the late 60s when the crime really got very bad
Right,
in that
right.
area and then
Well,
continued to just get worse and worse and worse.
well, crime in all of New York City, as a matter of fact, right? It's not,
Right. But that specific area was
but that
particularly
specifically was
vulnerable.
hit, right?
Yeah, it was specifically there was a lot of problems in that area. There was a riot in Harlem in 1964. It was just like there was pretty bad things going on in that area generally, and the thing is that area has never been fully invested. It was always kind of it wasn't not the most glamorous part of Manhattan in that sense. But the upside to that is there's a lot of very beautiful old architecture there.
Yeah.
When you go there, it's beautiful architecture that's ages old, pretty decently maintained, I have to say.
Sure. And you're talking about these buildings were built in the 1910s, around that area, a turn of the century. So yeah,
Yeah.
these buildings were old. You know?
Yeah, and there's not a lot of commercial office buildings or anything there. It's only like storefronts and stuff like that. So it has a very, like, I wouldn't say a suburban feel necessarily, but it definitely leans more towards that as far as Manhattan is concerned. Very different feelings from the rest of Manhattan for sure. And so anyway, bottom line is that our Russian world did not really exist there for too long. It basically tapered off in the 60s. And at that point, many of our ancestors, our families ended up moving on. They went to Long Island, or maybe even some other
Well,
parts of
the
the city. But for the most part,
tri-state area.
tri-state area, New Jersey was a major destination. Westchester, upstate, where we have a
Westchester,
lot of churches and
Connecticut. That's
parishes.
where everybody moved to, sure. The entire.
Right. And then some people went even further, California, Florida, so we have a pretty that's the area from where we started essentially, and then we started moving out.
Reading and going through the archives of Novoe Russkoe Slovo, there were still advertisements looking for, сдаю комнату, двухкомнатную квартиру, whatever, in the Hamilton Heights area up to the mid 70s. So the few old ladies that were still living there, and there were, some people still living there, they were trying to maybe capture the interest of the third wave, right? The новоприехавшие, as we used to call
Well,
it.
the Russian Jewish
The Russian
immigration that
Jewish,
started
right, that
coming.
came in the 70s. So they were trying to hopefully interest some of these people to rent out a room for them, a sort of income. So the Russians did scatter around, and the Russian Jewish diaspora, and some people that hopefully maybe we'll also have a podcast with some of them to connect some interesting dots later on further down our podcasts.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that was a good introduction, and this is just the beginning. There will be sequels to this, so we're just getting warmed up here on the whole on our Manhattan story, on our Manhattan project, as we affectionately call it. And we'd appreciate, again, this is our chance to solicit you for input. What do you know? Did you have anybody that lived there in that part of Manhattan, or maybe even other parts of Manhattan? We're also gathering information on other parts
Or
of
any
the
other
city in
part,
general.
whatever. Yeah, just keep it flowing because we're building something of interest and we want to connect. So there's not just New York City. You know, there's how many boroughs in New York and Staten Island and so on, but not just because there's also New Jersey and upstate New York and Long Island, wherever. Uh, it's just it's just incredible to see how this all developed and where we all ended up. You're still in Long Island. I'm down in Florida with some detours in Roanoke, Virginia, and so on. So,
Absolutely. All right. Well, I guess that one I guess we're going to wrap it up for now. But you're going to be hearing more from us. We're going to go into those areas, and we're gonna show you some more live footage. You already see some of it here in our webcast, and we're going to get down to specifics. That's our goal, to get as much specifics as we can with your help and participation.
absolutely, we'll be updating also Wikipedia if they permit us.
Wow, good luck with that. That's a major project, but yeah. All right.
So,
No,
thank you,
всего доброго.
thank you for joining, and we are the Ruszar, Yura, and Kato, or Kato.
Like, subscribe.